Hello there, everybody. I'm Jesse Weber, your host here on the Law and Crime Network and Law and Crime on Sirius XM Radio, channel 109. We're covering the Jeffrey Willis case out of Michigan, a convicted murderer who's on trial now for the second time that we're covering here on Law and Crime. This time he's on trial for the abduction and murder of a Michigan mother named Jessica Herringa, who disappeared back in April of 2013 from her gas station job. She worked at an ExxonMobil station the night of April 26, 2013. That was the last time anybody has ever seen or heard from her. It's a really, really strange, eerie, and disturbing case. What we're doing for you right now is this case has been decided. The jury came back with a verdict, but we are not letting you know what that verdict is just yet. We will, but later on in the program. We're analyzing this case from all different angles. We want you to fully understand what the prosecution's argument was and what the defense's argument was. Right now, in the prosecution's closing argument from yesterday, this is when they get into a little bit more information about cellular data, what he said to detectives, because there is a series of inconsistent statements. And a lot of times when you see inconsistent statements or outright lies by the defendant to authorities, that doesn't look good in front of a jury. Here is some more of the prosecution's closing argument from yesterday. Welcome back to the Law and Crime Network and Law and Crime on Sirius XM Radio. I'm your host, Jesse Weber. We're covering the Jeffrey Willis case out of Michigan, a man who's on trial for the abduction and murder of Jessica Herringa, a gas station clerk that went missing from her ExxonMobil gas station job back in 2013. She's never been seen since, but it's believed by the prosecution that Jeffrey Willis kidnapped her from that gas station and murdered her and disposed of her body. What you were just listening to in the prosecution's closing argument, which we're playing for you right there, is some of the inconsistent statements as well as how to track the defendant the night of. I want to bring back in criminal defense attorney Mark Eiglarsh. Mark, inconsistent statements from the defendant. I want to go over them with you. So, he never told detectives first when they arrived at his, officers that arrived at his house, that his wife was in his house or that she was sleeping. He wasn't forthcoming about that. Once they eventually knew he was married and they wanted to speak to his wife, he never told his wife, the police want to speak to you. Then, with the scratches that were on his face and arms, he told one witness that it was from a dog. He told another witness that it was from doing a brake job. Why would an innocent man who has nothing to do with the Herringa disappearance or murder, why would he have these inconsistent statements?
Well, because maybe he's not innocent. But you're saying, why would someone who is innocent say something like that? Maybe they're covering up for something else. And I believe that a jury wouldn't necessarily convict him if just lies were all that they had.
So you think that it helps, but it's not the end of the story when you tie it into the overall picture. And correct me if I'm wrong, you've seen cases before, even without a body, even if you don't know what happened to the victim, you can still not only go after the defendant, but secure a guilty verdict?
Yeah, this isn't like when we would play in the old neighborhood tag where you're safe, if you get to the tree, you're safe for murder if you just get rid of the body.
Right.
No, if it can be shown that you were the one responsible for disposing that body and you're the one who did it, then guilty.
And I think the best way to explain what Mr. Willis was doing that night, besides talking to him, is tracking his movements. And as the prosecution was saying, one of the ways they did this, they called Sergeant Jim McDonald, who tracked the cell phone tower records. They tracked the cell phone activity of Mr. Willis. And you know what a cell phone does, ladies and gentlemen? It can track you. Well, it tracked Mr. Willis. Let's learn a little bit more from when Sergeant Jim McDonald testified about where Jeffrey Willis was the night Jessica Herringa went missing. We're tracking the movements of the defendant in the Jeffrey Willis case here on the Law and Crime Network and Law and Crime on Sirius XM Radio, channel 109. I'm your host, Jesse Weber, and thanks for joining us. So we've been playing for you different parts of this case because we do have the verdict in the Jeffrey Willis case, but we're not letting you know what it is just yet. We're going to let you know about it later on in the program. But remember, anybody just joining us, Jeffrey Willis is a man who is on trial, or who was on trial, for the abduction and murder of Jessica Heringa, a gas station clerk, a Michigan mother, a woman that disappeared from her job on the night of April 26, 2013. She's never been heard from or seen since. As the prosecution builds this circumstantial evidence case against Mr. Willis, what did the prosecutor say, and what did we just learn from the testimony of Sergeant Jim McDonald? Well, what did we learn? We learned that based upon the cell phone evidence, as well as evidence from surveillance footage of this silver van, that Jeffrey Willis was moving from the area where Jessica disappeared to his grandfather's house. Let's bring back in criminal defense attorney Mark Eiglarsh. That's an interesting point, and I want to talk about this, tracking the defendant's movements. The cell phone went silent for a long period of time, the day after Jessica disappeared. There's videotape footage of a silver van moving northbound on Grand Haven Road from where Jessica's workplace was to his grandfather's house. So when you're looking at this evidence, and you first heard it, what did you make of it?
Two major things. One, he's a liar. More importantly, the evidence is consistent with him having the ability to commit this crime.
And the fact that his phone was off, what do you think about that for a long period of time?
Arguably further shows consciousness of guilt. He doesn't want to be noticed by anybody. Maybe he realizes that. I mean, there are many other explanations, but that's what I would argue.
You know, it's interesting. There's an argument that brought up by the defense in their closing argument that said, you want to say he's a master criminal, then why would he be sloppy in certain areas, again, with the scratches, the cleaning supplies that were found in his grandfather's basement. And then again, there's no DNA in his van, so he cleans it all up there, but he's sloppy in other areas of this crime. What did you make of that argument?
I'm just smiling because I've made that argument. You know, that's what you do. They say he's such a good criminal, but then look at all this. It's inconsistent with the person that they're alleging him to be.
I mean, it's a valid argument in the sense, like, you have this guy who, the defense said in their closing argument, he's scary, he's creepy, we'll admit to that. And just because he's a convicted murderer in one case doesn't mean that he's guilty of every other crime. But how hard is that for a jury, this jury, to separate?
Oh, it is impossible. I had a trial once where the judge, in the middle of the trial, allowed the jurors to hear about my client's prior criminal convictions. Their entire demeanor changed. They didn't even get to hear the nature and extent of those priors. In this case, in a murder trial, jurors are hearing about a prior murder. I mean, that's two strikes. The presumption of innocence just went out the window when they hear that.
And then again, we've seen other cases where there's people who have been convicted of other crimes and they are on trial for a new crime and they're found not guilty. And you hope that every juror that comes on will be impartial.
In all of those cases, they had David Copperfield as an expert to make all the evidence disappear.
That's right. We were covering the David Copperfield case here on Law and Crime. So, you know, I don't think there's any magicians or any magic acts here, as much as Mr. Willis may want that to be. Mark, stand by. Here's what we're going to do. We're going to take a break. When we come back, we have a lot more to discuss in the Jeffrey Willis case. We're going to move in to the defense's closing arguments. And remember, the defense tried to move for a judgment of acquittal, saying this case should be dismissed. Didn't work for them, but we'll hear what their arguments were when we come back from this short break. Stay tuned. There's a lot more. Welcome back to the Law and Crime Network and Law and Crime on Sirius XM Radio, channel 109. I'm your host, Jesse Weber, and thanks for joining us here. We are covering the Jeffrey Willis case in its entirety right now, a case about a convicted murderer, a man who was found guilty last year in the shooting death of jogger Rebecca Bletch back in 2014. Well, he's back on trial again for the second time. Now he's on trial for the abduction and murder of a Michigan mother named Jessica Heringa, who disappeared from her gas station job back in 2013, and she's never been heard from or seen since. The prosecution is moving forward with their case against Mr. Willis by tying in other events in his life to this crime. So they're saying, take a look at the evidence from the Rebecca Bletch murder. Evidence from there shows that he abducted and killed Jessica Heringa. Also, take a look at this potential abduction. It's alleged that Mr. Willis tried to abduct a teenager back in 2016. Evidence from that event is being used to link Mr. Willis to Jessica Heringa here, trying to establish a pattern. What we've been doing for you so far today is we have the verdict in the Jeffrey Willis case, but we're not going to let you know what that is just yet. We are going to let you know what that is later on in the program. What we're doing right now is analyzing this case in its entirety. We want you to understand what the prosecution has argued, and now we want you to understand what the defense argued. We are going to play for you right now the defense's closing argument. You can hear how they structure their defense and why they believe their client, while he may be creepy, while he may be scary, while he may be a convicted murderer, is not guilty of this crime. And when we come back, Mark Eiglarsh and I are going to talk all about it. This is, again, the defense's closing argument. Welcome back to the Law and Crime Network and Law and Crime on Sirius XM Radio, channel 109. I'm your host, Jesse Weber, and thanks for joining us. We're covering the Jeffrey Willis case out of Michigan, a man who is on trial for the abduction and murder of a Michigan woman named Jessica Heringa, a Michigan mother who disappeared from her gas station job back in April of 2013. We're recapping this case, and what you just heard was the beginning part of the defense's closing arguments. Now, I want to talk a little bit more about how they structure their argument and if there's any merit to it. I want to bring back in criminal defense attorney Mark Eiglarsh, and you can also speak to Mark at speaktomark.com. So I'm speaking to Mark right now. Mark, question for you. The defense's closing argument here. They have structured it to say, okay, look, this guy, Miss Heringa, was involved in heroin. She had a heroin dealer. This could entirely be caused by that. You know, if you look at the lights, the way that the gas station was set up, this is all possibly someone took her. Maybe she ran off because of the drug trade, and nothing to do with our client, Jeffrey Willis. What do you make of that argument?
I'm having flashbacks to OJ's murder case, when there was a suggestion that this might have been done by some type of drug kingpin. You know, there's some nefarious drug use going on with Nicole and some of the other characters, and maybe that's who did it. The reason why they did it in that trial and the reason why they did it in this trial is because you've got to answer the question, if not this defendant, then who? You've got to not necessarily take on a burden of proof, but suggest it may be someone else. You don't have to prove it, but put it out there for the jurors.
Well, I mean, that was one of the arguments that may have worked for OJ, but will it work here? Because the question is, and the prosecution, I thought it did a good job of this, establishing this in their case, that they had the lead detective on the stand. And he said, look, there was no money taken from the gas station. Jessica Heringa's wallet, her keys, they were all there. The cigarettes were there. If you're going to commit a drug-related crime, wouldn't there be missing money? Wouldn't there be some evidence of a robbery? But there wasn't anything like that.
Right. Strong argument on the other side. Someone is motivated by something other than money, and drug dealers are motivated by money. What else could they be motivated by? I don't know, getting pleasure from raping and killing women? Now let's go to his computer and let's see what was on there. And then, boom, we see that that's the type of guy they were allegedly dealing with.
Well, let's see how the defense did at asking these questions, or answering these questions, I should say, because this is what was left in the jury, trying to make sense of this. And listen very carefully. This is, again, the defense's closing arguments. How they explain why the wallet, why all this stuff was still there, and how they believe this is possibly a drug-related crime. And all they need to do is raise reasonable doubt. Take a look at the defense's closing argument. That's the defense's closing argument in the Jeffrey Willis case out of Michigan. Welcome back to the Law and Crime Network and Law and Crime on Sirius XM Radio. I'm your host, Jesse Weber. We're covering this case because Jeffrey Willis is a convicted murderer out of Western Michigan who's on trial for the second time. This time, he's on trial for the abduction and murder of a Michigan woman named Jessica Heringa, who disappeared from her gas station job back in April 26, 2013. Now, what is the defense saying? They're saying, don't blame our client. This is all a result of a drug deal gone bad because Jessica Heringa did have a heroin abuse problem. And she had that. Who knew that better than her boyfriend, Dakota Quayle Dyer? So he's explaining a little bit, the defense attorney, about her drug habits and how this really could have been a drug deal gone bad. I want to bring in criminal defense attorney Mark Eiglarsh, and I love speaking to Mark, but if you want to speak to Mark, go to speaktomark.com. Mark, the defense is bringing in this entire theory here that maybe this was a drug deal, maybe she turned down the lights because she didn't, want to deal with what's going on in the back. She's very light in weight. Something maybe happened to her from the drug abuse, the drug deal. Now, again, we keep talking about the defense doesn't need to put on a case, they don't need to show anything, but when we talk about reasonable doubt, remember that's what it is, they're showing reasonable doubt. Is this reasonable doubt the first time jurors are really hearing about this mysterious drug deal gone bad, really in the closing argument?
Well, it may be, and that's probably the only time that they're allowed to come up with these types of theories, because the evidence, there's no direct evidence of almost anything that they're saying. Nobody saw her take a hit of heroin. So what they're doing is, in closing arguments, they're lucky that the court allows wide latitude to make any reasonable inference, and it is argument. So it's, even if the state were to object, that's not been proven, no, I'm going to allow it. So they can make any reasonable inference, come up with any story that may fit the evidence. And they're doing a decent job of suggesting why her items were left on the scene. They're also devaluing her life to some extent. In other words, well, she's a junkie. She's not to be taken seriously like you would anybody else. But third and most significantly, if she really was actively using drugs around this time period, there were others that could have been around her that were violent, that could want to kidnap her and do something bad to her, other than the defendant.
And as you said, it's possible this is a reasonable inference. This is a reasonable explanation. And again, all the defense needs to convince one juror, that Jeffrey Willis, the prosecution did not prove beyond a reasonable doubt that he's the one responsible for her death. Now, who better to know about her drug abuse or her drug habits than, as I said, her boyfriend, or I should say, unfortunately, possibly her former boyfriend, Dakota Quayle Dyer. So this man took the stand earlier in the trial, and he explains a little bit more about the drug habits of the victim. Take a look. That's some critical testimony in the Jeffrey Willis case out of Michigan, which we're covering here on the Law and Crime Network and Law and Crime on Sirius XM Radio. Again, I'm your host, Jesse Weber. That was the testimony of Dakota Quayle Dyer, who was Jessica Heringa's boyfriend, or former boyfriend, I should say. That's the victim in this case. Back in April 26, 2013, Jessica disappeared. No one's ever seen her since. The last place anybody ever saw her or saw her alive or anywhere was her gas station job, where she worked at the ExxonMobil gas station. Jeffrey Willis is on trial for her murder. It's believed by the authorities and the prosecution that he abducted her from her gas station job, brought her back to his grandfather's house, killed her, and disposed of her body. Now, in the defense's closing argument, which was what we're playing for you right now, and we're playing you in conjunction with some crucial testimony, including Dakota Quayle Dyer, they're saying, look, this was a drug deal gone bad. Jessica was in the middle of a drug deal at the ExxonMobil gas station. That's why she disappeared. Something must have happened. Either she was kidnapped, maybe she OD'd. I want to bring back in Mark Eiglarsh. So they come up with a lot of different things here. They say it could be a drug deal gone bad. Maybe she overdosed. What you also heard a little bit of a flavor was, did you have problems in your relationship? And maybe she just walked off and disappeared off the face of the earth. But how realistic is that, or I should say, how reasonable is that when, again, she left her wallet and she left her keys at the gas station?
Listen, what the defense is doing, and hopefully they're telling jurors, look, we don't have to prove anything. We're saying that the police focused in on the wrong person. If they had just done a better investigation, they would have focused on some of these other theories. Let me advance some of the many theories other than him being guilty of first-degree murder that you should consider. And then they're saying, look, it's reasonably based upon the evidence that's been presented. That's reasonable doubt.
Yeah, you make a good point. Just introducing the idea that maybe there was something else going on here is enough. And here's what I want to do right now is, Mark, stand by, is in the defense's closing argument, which we're about to play some more of. This is when they get into the idea that Jessica was a mother. She had a son, but she maybe didn't feel that she was such a great mother. And why would they introduce this? to try to show maybe one night she just picked up and she left. Let's play a little of that the part of the defense's closing argument right now. Jeffrey Willis case out of Michigan. Welcome back to the Law&Crime Network and Law&Crime on Sirius XM Radio. We are covering this case because Jeffrey Willis is on trial for the abduction and murder of a woman named Jessica Heringa, who disappeared back in April of 2013. We're going to take a short break. When we come back, we are going to analyze more about this case because we have the verdict. We have the verdict. But we're not going to let you know until later on in the case. There's so much more to analyze in this case, including what the defense's theory is. We'll be back in a minute. That's an interesting argument, what we're listening to right there, the defense's closing argument in the Jeffrey Willis case out of Michigan. Welcome back to the Law&Crime Network and Law&Crime on Sirius XM Radio, channel 109. I'm your host, Jesse Weber. So Jeffrey Willis on trial for the abduction and murder of Jessica Heringa. It's alleged that he kidnapped her from her gas station job back in April of 2013 and killed her. Now, the defense, in their closing argument, as we recap this entire case, and we'll deliver to you the verdict later on in the program, the defense is saying, okay, let's talk about that insulin. And I want to talk about that insulin. Let's bring back on Mark Eiglarsh, criminal defense attorney, and go to speaktomark.com, where you can actually speak to the man himself and learn a little bit more about the law. Mark, this is an interesting one. We've got to talk about insulin. So Jeffrey Willis, his wife, is a diabetic. But she doesn't take insulin injections. She said she takes a pump. What was found in Mr. Willis's van was insulin injections. It was also noted that on this crumpled piece of paper that was found outside of Jeffrey Willis's grandfather's home, one of the things that said on there was insulin needles. Now, insulin's interesting because we all know that if you're diabetic, you need it. But what happens if you're not a diabetic person? We're going to play you the testimony in a little bit of Dr. Robert Hood, who explained that how it can incapacitate somebody. But what did the defense just say? That if he poked her with insulin, she would have screamed. And we know she didn't scream because the two eyewitnesses who were outside the gas station didn't hear her. What do you think about that argument?
I think that saying it so don't make it so. And that's why the judge instructs jurors all the time in every case that what the attorneys say is not evidence of anything. Now, guilty as charged. I'm that guy. I've been up there. I'll be up there next week telling jurors that a reasonable inference is the following, or this is what you should accept as fact, and sometimes they do and sometimes they don't. They're targeting those one or two jurors who are still thinking, you know, there is no body. We don't have a body here. It's possible that maybe she's still alive. So they're trying to hook those jurors in. And
maybe it'll work when we let our audience know what the verdict is ultimately later. Maybe it worked. Maybe it didn't. That's the question, because the insulin became a really big issue in this case, as I said, because of Jeffrey Willis's wife, why he had these insulin injections in his van as part of a rape kit that it's been dubbed, why he had a note, or let me rephrase, why there was a note outside that had insulin injections on it. And again, what does insulin do to a person like Jessica Heringa? What would it do? Well, let's learn a little bit more about it from Dr. Robert Hood, who's a diabetes expert. He testified earlier in the trial. Take a look. Welcome back, everybody. I'm your host, Jesse Weber, here on the Law&Crime Network and Law&Crime on Sirius XM Radio. We're covering the Jeffrey Willis case out of Michigan, a convicted murderer who's on trial for the second time, this time for the abduction and murder of Jessica Heringa, a gas station clerk that disappeared from her job back in April of 2013. As we recap the case, we're listening to the defense's closing argument, as well as some crucial testimony from key witnesses. And who you just heard was Dr. Robert Hood talking about insulin. And why is that a factor? Because insulin, it's believed, was maybe injected into Jessica Heringa by Jeffrey Willis to incapacitate her and kidnap her. Now, the reason we talk about that is because insulin needles were found in Jeffrey Willis's rape kit in his van. There's also a note, a crumpled note, that was found outside of Jeffrey Willis's grandfather's house that said insulin needles. I want to bring back in Mark Eiglarsh. We talk about insulin, we're talking about incapacitating somebody. what makes this case so eerie is we don't know really what happened. And one of the questions that everybody's been asking is, how does a human being kidnap another human being in a public place like a gas station? And how would you be able to do it so quickly without anybody seeing? Is insulin the way that maybe it's done?
That expert was wonderful. And just for those listening to this on Sirius, when you talked about a rape kit, you used air quotes.
That's true.
You did. Yeah, I mean, the defense would have argued, he didn't do this. Insulin needles there, that doesn't necessarily incapacitate anybody. Well, enter Dr. Robin Hood, whatever,
Robert Hood.
He comes to the rescue and saves the day and says, no, if you use this kind and this amount, she's out like a light. It's perfect.
I mean, we're trying to find answers here to questions we don't have. And the question that I have for you before we go to our next break is, why would Jeffrey Willis have these insulin needles if his wife, who's diabetic, use a pump?
Right. Well, there's only one conclusion the prosecutors are going to argue. I don't know what the defense said on this issue, but it just doesn't look good. Again, that alone, even if they can't explain it, wouldn't lead to a conviction, assuming they're able to get one in this case. Certainly, that's a huge piece of the puzzle.
Well, the defense is doing whatever they can to rebut the prosecution's theory of the case. There's a lot of circumstantial evidence against their client. When we come back from this short break, we're going to go a little bit deeper into the defense's argument and hear what they really think happened to Jessica Heringa on the night of April 26, 2013. We'll be right back. Welcome back, everybody. I'm your host, Jesse Weber, here on the Law and Crime Network and Law and Crime on Sirius XM Radio. Thank you for joining us. We are covering the Jeffrey Willis case out of Michigan. As I keep saying, it is a really, really interesting case with some disturbing and bizarre facts and eerie facts, because it's really about a woman named Jessica Heringa, who disappeared from her gas station job back in 2013. She was a mother, she was a young lady, and she disappeared that night and has never been seen again or heard from again since. Jeffrey Willis is on trial for her murder. It's believed that he abducted her from her ExxonMobil gas station job, took her back to his grandfather's house, killed her, and disposed of her body. Now, even though there's no forensic DNA tying Miss Heringa to Jeffrey Willis, even though there's no real concrete eyewitness identification seeing this happen, the prosecution is moving forward with their case with a lot of extreme circumstantial evidence against this man. So when the defense came forward with their closing argument, they tried to say, you know what? This has nothing to do with my client. This is about a drug deal gone bad. Jessica Heringa was a heroin abuser. She was involved in this. Who knows? Maybe she got into a fight with her drug dealer. Maybe it was a drug deal gone bad. Maybe she was unhappy with her life and she just disappeared off the face of the earth. What I'm going to play for you right now is some more of the defense's closing argument. This is again where they say this is what they believe ultimately happened to Jessica that night. And they try to explain one other key bit of evidence. Jessica's blood was found outside of the gas station. And they try to explain that away. When we come back, when we're going to play you this defense closing argument, Mark Eiglarsh and I are going to talk a little bit more about it. Take a look. Those are some very interesting arguments by the defense in their closing argument in the Jeffrey Willis case out of Michigan. Welcome back to the Law and Crime Network and Law and Crime on Sirius XM Radio. I'm your host, Jesse Weber. We're covering the Jeffrey Willis case, again, a convicted murderer who's on trial for the second time, this time for the abduction and murder of a woman named Jessica Heringa, a gas station clerk that disappeared from her job in 2013. Now, the defense is saying this isn't my client's fault. This is Jessica Heringa's fault. Let's bring back in Mark Eiglarsh. I'm happy to speak to you, Mark, and you can also speak to Mark at speaktomark.com. Mark, we got to go through this. We got to go through all of the defense's different theories here. Now, for all of our Sirius XM listeners, what you just heard was the defense saying, this is the guy. This is the guy that Susan Follett, this eyewitness, the person that saw this mysterious silver van driven by this mysterious individual outside of the ExxonMobil gas station in the 11 p.m. hour, the night that Jessica disappeared. This is the person she identified. It was an actual sketch, a rendering. didn't look anything like the defendant. In fact, as the defense said, she had ample opportunity to point out Mr. Willis and say, that's the guy I saw that night. But she never positively identified him. That's a strong piece of evidence, right, Mark?
This is probably their moment. Their biggest argument throughout this trial, and I pointed this out on previous appearances, you've got an eyewitness who the state is relying upon. The prosecution wants everyone to believe this woman because she sees the silver van and she sees other things that helps their case. So they want her to be credible. But from that same mouth comes a description of the person that she allegedly saw, who's supposed to be the perpetrator, who has an unshaved, well, strike that, a shaved face, right? And he, right? So there's that.
It's either shaved or very little facial hair, right?
Right. Then the hair. At one point he said that she described it as long and parted down the middle, and apparently his hair is not like that. So how do you reconcile that, right? You're the prosecution. What do you do? Well, eyewitness identification is not necessarily easy to do. It's fallible.
It's making facts convenient to you when they're convenient for you. And I think that's a really interesting point, because you've heard witnesses say, oh, he had blonde highlights, he had shorter hair, but I'm not 100% sure if it was when Jessica disappeared, or maybe it was earlier than that or before that. And I think that's a really big point for the defense. I also have to say, I think they touched upon a really weak part of the prosecution's case. They have really no proof. They don't have a lot of proof that Mr. Willis took the gun. I'm talking about this .22 Walther gun that was found in his van, which is believed he stole from his co-worker, and which they believe he used when he shot and killed Rebecca Blech. There's no evidence that he took that gun, hit Jessica over the top of the head, she bled out on the sidewalk. They made the point that that was very weak, and they also said, how do you kidnap somebody, tie them up, incapacitate them in a short amount of time? I think they were dissecting something really important there, but I'm curious about your view.
Absolutely. Again, I think, as much as I've dismissed some of their arguments before, this is their strongest stuff. And understand the backdrop. The mother of the deceased testified that she believes that her daughter is still alive. That we haven't spoken about, Jesse. That's key. Now, that could be, of course, as the prosecution's going to argue, well, if she wants to believe that she's still alive but isn't. No. I say, if I'm the defense lawyer here, a mother knows. She knows her daughter's still alive. We don't have a murder here. So then all of the facts that he's bringing up is now against the backdrop of that testimony.
Mark, I guarantee you not only are our listeners and viewers really resonating that point, but I'm sure the jurors were as well. Here's what we're going to do. We're going to show right now the defense's continuation of the defense's closing argument. This is when they talk about the pornographic videos that were found on Mr. Willis's computer, because the defense had some explaining to do here. This man had a lot of murder videos, rape videos, pornographic videos. How do you explain this to a jury? Let's see how the defense did. This is, again, a continuation of their closing argument. The defense is making some really strong arguments there in the Jeffrey Willis case out of Michigan. Welcome back to Law and Crime. We're covering the Jeffrey Willis case, a man who's on trial for the abduction and murder of a Michigan woman named Jessica Heringa, who disappeared back in 2013. What the defense was trying to say is, look, my client may have all of these terrible videos on his computer of murder, rape, kidnapping. He may be a creepy guy. He may be a scary guy. But that doesn't mean that he had anything to do with Jessica's disappearance. And as he said it to the jury. He goes, how do I come back? How do I explain my client to you after you hear all about this stuff that he has on his computer? Well, one of the things he did earlier in the case is when Gerald McCarthy was on the stand. This is a computer expert who found all of these videos on Jeffrey Willis's computer. Take a look. This is how Jeffrey Willis's defense attorney cross-examined Mr. McCarthy. Listen very carefully. This is how he makes his point. This is from earlier in the case. Welcome back to Law and Crime, everybody. I'm your host, Jesse Weber. We're following the Jeffrey Willis case out of Michigan, a man who's on trial for the abduction and murder of a Michigan mother named Jessica Herringa. She disappeared back in 2013. Her body has never been found. No one knows what happened to her. She's never been heard from or seen since she disappeared from her gas station job. We're trying to analyze this case in its entirety, and what we're doing right now is analyzing the defense's case. The defense's closing argument really brought up the fact about Jeffrey Willis's computer, and I want to talk a little bit more about it with Mark Eiglarsh. So his computer had all these terrible videos on it: murder, rape, kidnapping. The defense attorney said it himself. He may be a creepy guy, he may be a scary guy, doesn't mean he had anything to do with Jessica's disappearance. And also he made the point that this file on Jessica Herringa, the victim herself, that was found on the defendant's computer, it was created at a certain point after she appeared on the news, correct? And I think that's a key point. What do you think about this computer testimony?
I think from the defense perspective, it sucks. There's nothing good about this. These are the arguments that I've had to make in certain trials where the evidence is just overwhelming. Anytime you're calling your client creepy and scary in a homicide case where what was done was creepy and scary, that's not good.
Well,
not a good position, Jesse.
And the fact that the files were created after she appeared on the news. So again, we've talked about it earlier. The fact that they didn't appear before. It's not like he was a cold, calculated person who researched her and got all this information. What do you think about that?
It gives the defense an argument. It's better than if he had created it before. But still, Jesse, there's two types of people in this world: those who create files on dead people and those who don't. Whether you do it before or after, it's not a good fact for the defense.
Mark, you made some really great points today, both for the defense and the prosecution. We can't wait to see what the verdict is later today when we announce it. Everybody, Mark Eiglarsh, criminal defense attorney. Go to speaktomark.com. Thanks again, Mark.
Thanks, Jess.
All right, here's what we're going to do right now before our next break. I want to continue playing for you the defense's closing argument and talking a little bit more about just because this defendant is creepy and is into certain stuff doesn't make him the killer of Jessica Herringa. Take a look.